my name's Hannah and you're listening to the Brunel Let's Talk About It Mental Health and Wellbeing podcast. So today's episode is going to be about depression and mindfulness. My thinking behind this was a little bit because a lot of people are starting now. They've just, settled in, and it can sometimes be a bit daunting. Some people might be feeling a bit sad. Also with winter approaching, the gloomy weather, it can sort of affect how you feel about things. So I thought for students, this might be something that you might be able to relate to, or maybe you'll get the information you need to maybe ask for help if that's what you feel like you need to do. And I have a very exciting guest with me today. Do you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. Thank you for inviting me. So my name is Elena Antonova. I'm a reader in contemplative neuroscience here at Brunel. And my main specialism is neuroscience of mindfulness. I work with experienced meditators using various methods of neuroimaging, including magnetic resonance imaging, electroencephalography, psychophysics, and looking at emotional regulation in experienced long-term mindfulness practitioners, and then applying what I learn from them, or what rather we learn. I never work alone. It's always the work of the team, of course, to the prevention and management of mental health challenges such as psychosis mainly, but also depression, of course. And depression, as we know, is what we call comorbid, can occur with many different conditions that impair our daily function.
So, you know what? The reason why I thought I wanted to bring in this mindfulness, I feel like it's not spoken about enough. I hear a lot about, different forms of dealing with certain emotions. When you think, you hear about CBT, you hear about other forms. I think mindfulness was something that I took your course. And I think there was a lot that I learned, and we'll get into that in a bit. But I'm just going to put some stats out there for listeners. Something that was quite shocking to me, first of all, this was from the World Health Organization, but it says that at any one point of time, there is about 264 million people who have depression. So again, with the prevalence of it, I thought this is something that would be quite important to talk about today. And then also there was another stat that was saying that 39% of people who have depression or anxiety access treatment. Now, I know there is a debate on whether everyone needs treatment, but there is space and conversation to be had about if people are struggling, are they able and do they feel like they are able to get the help, access treatment, and also just have enough information to know what to do. Not necessarily completely just, solve it straight away, but just know what the next steps are. And so I thought we would just first go into, we're speaking about depression, but what is depression? So just a little bit of background about what depression is and what are the symptoms.
Well, the main symptoms of depression, there are many, but the main ones are low mood, feelings often of guilt, self-loathing, feelings of low self-worth, loss of pleasure in activities that normally are enjoyable, so-called anhedonia. It could involve sleep disruption, often does, either sleeping too much or not enough.
Yeah.
And even if sleeping long hours, not feeling refreshed afterwards. There are other symptoms such as anxiety, often comorbid, but not always.
Yeah.
And feeling generally anxious can make us feel depressed on its own right. So these are experiences we all can relate to through our lifetime. But normally they don't last maybe more than 24 hours, perhaps a week. But to warrant a diagnosis of major depressive disorder, they should last for over 2 months. So if that is the case, then something somewhere is not quite resolving, and therefore some support might be helpful.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned at the beginning, you kind of nailed the main things about what can cause a depression, particularly in a young individual, very dramatic changes, leaving family home and coming to study on campus. That can be accompanied by personality traits. For example, a lot of psychology students would be familiar with Big Five personality traits, and these involve extroversion, introversion, neuroticism, openness to experience, and so on. So extroversion seems to be protective against developing depression, and that's understandable, because if you are in a socially enriching environment, that social support goes a long way, protecting against depression. In terms of the availability of peer support, we do chat to each other about our low moments, and empathizing with the peer, the peer empathizing with you, with your troubles and tribulations, and be able to relate to them as well. That shared experience goes a long way about not necessarily normalizing our experiences, but showing that they are shared, and therefore it's possible to, without getting too attached to them, just allow them to pass through it. And this is in a way kind of one of the cornerstones of mindfulness, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And also introversion can lead to isolation, feelings of loneliness, and that can create its own sort of spiral towards depressive moods.
I mean, you see it like online when you do like search about how to help with depression. A lot of them say, try to keep an active social life. And obviously people who are extroverted tend to be more socially active than perhaps someone who's introverted, right? So
it's absolutely true. But on the other hand, it can be catch-22, because as someone starts, even in, a very extroverted, positively minded person, when they met with really strong challenges in life, stress can always, some dramatic changes, God forbid, the loss of the loved one, the loss of home. So many people are unsettled, uprooted these days from their homes through everything that goes in the world, without going into the details. Even the most positively minded individual would be perturbed by something like this happening. And it's a normal reaction as well to really challenging external circumstances. Actually, I can't remember exact quote, but Krishnamurti, who's one of the mindfulness teachers, we can say, said that being well adjusted to spectacularly distorted society is not a sign of good health. It's an insanity in its own right. But how we meet those experiences within ourselves. And that's where mindfulness can really be helpful, because it's sustainable self-regulatory skill. So rather than putting our well-being in the hands of even health professionals, which of course we should do when we really need help, or a pharmaceutical preparation of some sort, we really develop the capacity to be present with our experiences. We often hear the word acceptance in the context of mindfulness, but it's not a sort of passive resignation to what we feel. It's more just being utterly honest with myself. Well, this is how I'm feeling right now.
I think getting there is quite hard to be that honest.
Yes, exactly.
And that raw,
and that, the suppression of the experience. If we think about the word depression, we often feel that the opposite of depression is joy. Yeah. But actually, on the other scale of the depression is expression, right? Yeah. So it's really, mindfulness is really about allowing yourself that courage, that inner honesty to take the lid off and see what's boiling underneath. And then having the tools to deal with the boil, right? Yeah. So it doesn't spill over. Yeah. And what allows it to deal with that kind of boiling soup of suppressed emotions, ruminative negative thoughts of self-loathing, self-criticism, which is very much the mechanism that not only gets someone into depression, but sustains depression and then leads to recurrence or relapse, those sort of negative, recurrent negative thinking that get into the pattern. So if we continue to, once we see those bubbles, right, of that soup of everything, all our traumas and misgivings that we have towards life and how we related to life in the past, we can inflame it further by judging it and reacting to it. And then we are facing the boil over.
Yeah.
And it becomes even more difficult to manage, leading to overwhelm and so on. But we can just notice what is there, be completely clear. So acceptance, non-judgment, non-reactivity allows us clarity. It affords us wisdom to see what is actually there that we're dealing with. And then rather than reacting, often out of destructive habitual patterns, we can respond. And there is no response that fits all. Obviously, our responses will be structured in some ways by the cultural background and so on, inevitably. But overall, it affords us this sort of clarity and wisdom of what would be an appropriate response to this particular experience, in this particular context, in this particular situation, in the relationship with this particular person.
Yeah.
Because, we're not born with the life manual that tells us, okay, if this happens, do this, if that happens. So each case is really case-by-case basis. There are certain patterns and general rules, of course. But that necessity of really being present with what is there, we often hear in the context of mindfulness and being the now. But what that actually means, we can be being the now in a very reactive way, a very judgmental way. So what does it make it mindful? Is just settling into it in complete stillness and openness. And when we say stillness, it's the stillness of the awareness itself, right? Which can deal with whatever turbulence that appears in it, whatever thoughts, whatever feelings, whatever sensations. It takes a while to be able to stay in that stillness when all of that is happening, right? We're not trying to suppress anything. We're not silencing the mind. We're just allowing for anything that wasn't allowed to be expressed to express itself, to show itself. Buddhists use an analogy of a snake that undoes its own knots.
Oh, okay.
So by just allowing it to be there without reacting to it, rejudging it in some way, because that's why it's originally got stored, because it got sort of reified in that way, fixated in that way. And once it's expressed, its energy then kind of just, the bubble bursts and the air is gone. And the water joins the rest of the pot.
Yeah.
And so we can actually experience, and often do, an energy boost when we have allowed the time to process those emotions and thoughts and so on.
Yeah. I mean, I think with what you were saying, I think one of the hardest things, from what I've heard and also I guess personal experiences, when you're struggling with something like that, is that first step of acknowledging that there is something wrong. And I feel, not necessarily that I feel that there's something wrong, but it's just accepting that you need to work on something, right? That there is that first step where you're just like, I don't know if I want to go into this. I don't even want to go into the thoughts of why I feel like this, because a lot of the time when you feel depressed or if you're feeling anxious, for me, it was something that was triggering it or something that made me feel like that. And sometimes you don't want to go into why the triggering is happening or what's causing the trigger. And that can be uncomfortable things that you have to deal with. I think with mindfulness is what I think was one of the biggest things for me was the non-judgment part. When I first went into the course, being completely honest, I'm just going to be really raw, but I really hated it. I was like, I hate that I have to be this but I was thinking it in the wrong way. As I went on with the course, I realized that I was approaching it completely wrong. In the beginning, I was thinking that I have to reach a certain goal. I have to do this. I have to do that. I have to think about this. But more so, it was just appreciating that these thoughts exist in the first place and not being so judgmental about it. They are there. But also, I remember even therapists and stuff in the past have said that, let a thought come and let it go through. And I think that's a really good way to think about it. Not everything has to be, push away and lock it away and don't think about it. Maybe the thing that needs solving is a part of just accepting that it exists. Sometimes we pretend like it doesn't exist. And I think that's just pushing off the inevitable. And I think that was a big sort of eye-opening experience for me, is to realize that, sometimes the uncomfortable things is the thing you need to go through to feel comfortable again. So yeah, I think that's a good point. I think the first thing is just definitely the hardest is accepting that you do need to take on this step.
Thank you for sharing your experience of sort of stepping into this river of mindfulness practice. And in what you said, that there's so much there to unpack. So if I may, I would like to just make a few points that might be helpful to those who would like to try mindfulness, and just to perhaps allow for the penny to drop sooner.
Yeah.
And the kind of things you very eloquently picked up on is that a lot of us, just because through our schooling, and that's now true of most of the world, not just the Western societies, right? We are taught from very early on to do, right?
Yeah.
We are in predominantly using the doing mode, right? And we apply that doing mode when we start mindfulness practice. And as you rightly said, in mindfulness, we don't need to go into the why, and that sort of why, actually what fuels ruminative thinking in depression.
Yeah.
So mindfulness kind of cuts through right to, okay, this is the experience right now. Okay, how I'm going to deal with it. And we can't stop the flow of experiences. You know, you said the therapist that you allow the thought to flow through you. And if you remember, we used the Rumi poems, The Guest House, allowing the experiences to come in, welcoming them like guests into our house. We can't stop that flow. What we need to relearn is to flow with it. You know, as children, we flow with it. You know, we ran, we fell, we felt the pain, we cried, and then a second later, we're back on the slide for another go. But as adults, we forget that. We get very much stuck in certain experiences, particularly if they, what we call salient, you know, to us, meaningful in some way, or valid, you know, negative ones. We all tend to have that bias. So allowing them to see the experiences for what they are and allow them to flow through it. Easier said than done. It takes a bit of time, but it's the patience, and it's noticing, where am I coming from? Am I attacking this from the head? Am I in the doing mode? Or am I actually learning to just completely being present, mind and body aligned? You know, because that's why we use the body and the breath in mindfulness at the beginning, because the breath, the body are always in the present moment experience. So the mind tends to either go into the past, often ruminating, regretting about certain actions. You know, we had a round with someone in the morning and, I should have said this, or I should have said that. And, you know, or we're ruminating about something that yet to happen and getting into cycle of worry about things that might not even occur, right? But it gives us an actual real experience of worry. But by aligning straight into the present moment experience, by connecting with the breath, by becoming aware of our surroundings, we bring the mind into alignment with the physical body, which then allows us to have that sort of openness, the space and awareness for things to come up. And and then we have to be with it, right? We have to be with it. But again, it's one step at a time. The more we understand what it means not to non-judge, right? And what it means not to react, by observing how we actually do habitually constantly judge, how we do habitually constantly reacting. So it's that noticing what we habitually do that then allows us to, okay, well, let me just unwind that. You know, release that in myself, see how that feels. So that's why mindfulness, it's difficult, you know, for the beginner to do it whilst running a marathon or even a sprint, as an analogy. We really need to sit quietly. It's like the analogy of allowing a water full of sediment, for the sediment to settle so we can see the clarity of water. Same with seeing the clarity of our awareness, and then we can see how those little, you know, sediments arise, how they get perturbed, and how we allow them to then settle down, even dissolve completely.
Yeah, I mean, I think with with mindfulness, I mean, we'll go into just briefly explain what mindfulness afterwards, but just as adding on to that point was, I remember even in a practical sense, as someone who's constantly fidgeting and someone who loves to just like constantly move around, that was a big thing for me. And I think, breath work and everything that was contained in sort of acknowledging your body, I think that was a big like sort of change in just calming me down in that very moment. Just even having that moment to go, just relax, stop. Because you don't realize that you have these habits of, I do everything. I bite my nails, I bite my lips, I shake my leg. I do every sort of, anxious habit. So something like that can sort of ground you and bring you back to sort of feeling your body in that moment, if that makes sense.
Grounding is very important. And we almost got to the point now within ourselves, and I would say even kind of younger generation is even more prone to this, as I see it in my teenage daughters. Relaxation, bodily relaxation and mental calmness is almost like a luxury people very rarely can tap into,
a good point.
right?
Yeah.
And of course, social media, the devices, being left to their devices quite literally is a big part actually of that. And because, I can see it particularly with my younger daughter, who in a way doesn't know any better because it's so normalized within her peer group that that's what everyone does. But what it does lead to is a fragmentation of our awareness, right? Because we, if we think what usually captures our attention in those sorts of social media platforms, those short reels, this constant jumping from one thing to the next,
stimulation,
constantly disconnected from the body and what's happening. Yes, it can be fun for a while, but long term, it leads to that fragmentation leads to depletion.
Yeah.
So when you use the word grounding, it's very much the case that by grounding into the body, we're starting to actually tap into that wholeness, and by stopping to attach to each passing emotion or experience, we then achieve this unification of the field of the awareness that inherently has the sense of peacefulness and calm. It's not something we need to cultivate. Yeah. It's actually there for us to tap into if we understand what gets us out of it.
Yeah. I mean, just for like the average listener that's sort of listening to this podcast and this episode, what is mindfulness in terms of like, what does it entail? What do you do? Just in case there's someone who's just heard of it for the first time.
Sure. Well, mindfulness is in secular science and clinical tradition is defined as the awareness that arises when we pay attention on purpose in the present moment, without judgment and without reactivity. So non-judgment and non-reactivity, the words we used quite a bit already in our conversation, those are essence of what makes awareness mindful. Because of course we're all aware, right? Unless we're in a very deep sleep and then we're not aware that we're aware. Because some would say there's still awareness, there's just no awareness, meta-awareness.
Yeah.
But our awareness, it's often just runs without us actually being aware of it. It sounds paradoxical, but it's true, right? Yeah. So us becoming consciously aware, sort of conscious awareness it seems like a tautology, right? Saying the same thing twice, but actually consciously aware. I'm intentionally aware that I'm aware. So I would say just that as a starting point already brings us into, like, gives that subtle shift. Like if your listeners just take a few seconds and just become aware that they are aware.
So how can that help with depression in terms of their daily lives? And if they feel like they have a certain, I guess, depressive feeling, how can mindfulness help in that aspect?
So as we become aware that we're aware, we become aware of what is happening in our experience, okay? And it takes some investigation to see how thoughts leads to, or feelings lead to thoughts, how these relate to body sensations. And one of the mechanisms of mindful emotion regulation, it's actually working with body sensations. If we think about the word emotion, it's sort of energy in motion, and that ripples through the body, that goes through body sensations. And if you remember, we did some cognitive exercises as a part of mindfulness course, which demonstrated to us that even imaginary events, like imagining a friend didn't notice us, produces real emotions, right? Like, well, why? People go into all sorts of reactions. And if they have a proneness to depression, they're more likely to feel that there's something wrong with them. And therefore, their friend didn't wave at them when they saw them on the streets. That's kind of an imaginary scenario. So those kind of negative thoughts, critical thoughts, they produce real physiological reactions hormonally and in terms of neurotransmitters, right? So if we then go into the body and we work on the level of body sensations rather than trying to, inverted commas, attack thoughts and emotions, we can nip it in the bud. So this whole kind of cascade of ruminative thinking, which then perpetuates emotional reactivity to whatever triggered this episode of ruminative thinking, it just settles down like a storm in a cup by just staying with the cup and allowing the storm to settle. Allowing is a key word. So we're not doing anything, right? We're just allowing, we're giving it space to unwind. And if we're not adding oil to the fire, and oil is judgment and reactivity, then I don't know how they calculated it, where this came from, but I've heard it a number of times now that an average experience, kind of thought-related, lasts about 47 seconds. So anything beyond that would be perpetuated by some, what we call schema, habitual thinking pattern, holding it in place.
Yeah. I mean, so this might sound like a silly question, but I'm just trying to think. So, when we think of mindfulness, I'm just thinking how other people might view it as, when you hear it from like TV and how you see it in like shows and stuff. A lot of people think of like, just sitting down, doing yoga. Can you do mindfulness practices whilst in that moment? Like, for example, you just said like a friend doesn't wave. Is there anything you can do in that sort of moment in time in terms of mindfully reacting to a situation like that? Or does it have to be something you do in your go home and you sit down on a mat? It's not always like that, right?
But both. It's both. It's really, we can't deepen the practice and get this understanding of how it works unless we have spent some time allowing the sediment to settle. So we have the clarity of how the whole thing works. We need to understand our mind. And for that, we need time. But once we've done that, then of course the application comes in real life and the nitty-gritty of those interactions or stressful events that can trigger us. And then if we understand, and all of us have our own reactive patterns, right? So, and therefore we need to know our own. And then I know, okay, I have a tendency to go into that. That's how it feels in the body. I go into what's the word? I start thinking that I offended them in some way. So and that tightens around the chest, and that's the sensation that I'm having. So if I go into the awareness of that, because I know that's how it works for me, then you can release it much faster.
Would you say it's like sort of the equivalent of, or similar to how, like in CBT, your first in sessions with your therapist, which you're doing like the work, like how you said at first, you'll sit down, you're working on it. And then later you have these not natural, but sort of these differences in how you used to be, or how you used to be and how you are now. Is it sort of like that, where you sort of work on it at the beginning and then...
It's like learning any skill, isn't it? We need to give it time for it to become a second nature, so it kind of just happens automatically. But it's as you know, I like emphasizing it when I teach mindfulness, it's effortless effort.
Yes.
If we're attacking it again through doing mode, effortful mode, we're going to miss the trick, because it's exact opposite of that. It's about sort of dropping into what is already there. It's not gaining something outside of ourselves, something that we need to what we do, we're developing insight, right? We're developing our ability to see how one thing leads to another, how we react to things. Some people tend to suppress or avoid unpleasant experiences. Some, just by the virtue of actually pushing them, right, inside of themselves, that has a certain phenomenal feel, that has a felt sense to it. Yeah, and we can notice that in our mindfulness meditation practice. Some people distract themselves immediately with something more pleasurable. Yeah, so it's another coping mechanism, but they deal to the same thing. It doesn't get processed.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So and then it raises its head quite similarly. Either you blow up on someone down the line about the little thing, or you go into sort of self-critical depressive mode because there's stuff starting to accumulate that didn't get processed, and that one thing leads to another.
I think that's like something that I remember is like when I wasn't dealing with my emotions and I was just sort of, I guess, suppressing it, like you were saying. What ends up happening is I'd burn like toast, and I'd be freaking out over it because the toast burning wasn't a big deal. But for me, it was just bubbling up, and then I would just explode at the smallest thing. And everyone would be like, it's just toast, like, why are you crying? Yes. But I'd be in tears, and no one would understand that it's because there's all these things that I've sort of pushed aside, and this was like the thing that ticked me off.
Well, that's a nice, thank you for supporting with your personal experience. And it's important. So in addition to this sort of need for effortless effort. So the only effort is remembering to drop into that space, whatever you can, right, during your daily life. And we're not talking about an hour of meditation each day. I mean, it would be wonderful. No one would not benefit from it if it's done, with a sort of understanding of how to go about it. But even 10 minutes a day can be a game changer. Yeah. And it certainly was for me.
It was for me.
I've shared with you guys when we started the course that's how I started. Yeah. I was actually a second-year undergraduate student. I was introduced by a fellow student to what we now call secular mindfulness. I got a few meditation instructions from him, and off I went and practiced them in my sort of DIY fashion, because there was a time before Headspace Up and Calm and Insight apps. There's so many resources these days to support the practice. And it's important for us to have those self-regulation skills, right? And so 10 minutes a day for me was a dramatic game changer. And therefore, I'm so keen on teaching this to others, researching it and teaching it to others, because I know how beneficial it can be.
I mean, I would say, as in someone who's sort of done it from personal experiences, give it a go. Honestly, give it a go. If I thought of it in the beginning, if it works, amazing, and if it doesn't, I learned something, right? For me, it did work. In the beginning, I thought it wasn't going to. I was like, I don't know what this is. I don't know if I can do this. Towards the end, I sort of sorted. I feel like I wish I had understood it in the beginning, what mindfulness was, because I feel like I approached it with the wrong mentality. And I feel like,
But there's no right and wrong here, because by doing it wrong in inverted commas, you saw how your mind naturally approaches things. Yeah. So that was the reveal, right? The revelation is right there.
Yeah, I feel like that was also part of the journey, was the way that I went through it. Yeah,
100%.
But I think, even if it's not necessarily doing exactly what we were speaking about in terms of mindfulness, even taking 10 minutes to just sort of ground yourself, which is sort of, I guess, mindfulness, but, just take some time out for yourself. I feel like we're so engrossed in we have to do this, we have to do that. Like you were saying about doing. Like you wake up and you have an alarm that wakes you up. So a lot of people wake up to an alarm. It's a blaring sound. You start the day off like that. And then you're checking your phone. Then you're replying to emails. This is how I spend my day. I reply to emails. Then I'm sending off a report here, then I go to uni, then I come back, do another work. We're constantly doing things.
Yep.
And even though we're doing it to build ourselves up in one way, we're not also looking at the mental part of mentally how you're feeling and how you're feeling also, I guess, spiritually, just sort of getting yourself back into that space of that I deserve some time to just take time out.
Totally. Yeah. And that's the attitude to have. I deserve to give myself that time.
Yeah. That was a big one. Yeah.
So rather than making it a chore and it's another must, I must do it to get my mental health back on track. No, I deserve those 10 minutes of mental hygiene. Like I deserve half an hour of blissful bath, undisturbed by family and other demands on my time. So if we approach it that way, and I always recommend that one finds the practice that comes effortlessly, that actually feels like it's replenishing your energy rather than drains you further. And then there's so many different practices. It can be secular mindfulness, as it's taught, or could be other contemplation practices. Just find what works for you at this point in time. You can change it later as well. And in fact, in my experience, it's interesting and important to change because you learn something different from different approaches to contemplation, to meditation. What is contemplation? Understanding how mind works, right? Who we are as human beings. I mean, it's part of our existence, isn't it? And if we neglect that aspect of ourselves, that in itself can manifest as depressive symptoms because it's a sort of our being calling to us to reconnect with ourselves. And then the way we connected, aligned with that sense of calmness and peace inside of ourselves, that's what then we start expressing outwardly. And that has a knock-on effect on our life, right? Because our relationships become more harmonious. Our resilience to stress and ability to respond rather than react in a difficult, challenging situation at work. If we react to someone in anger when they overstepped our boundaries, rightly so, it feels like self-righteous anger. But this reactivity can then lead to a series of events that will cause us so much stress.
Absolutely.
Okay, but if we responded to it, firmly but gently, affirming our boundaries as we should, but with kind of wisdom and understanding of another person's perspective, or at least bringing our perspective to the table, then the whole situation can dissipate there and then, and actually give us a sense of empowerment, give us a sense of this relationship being strengthened because you actually stood in your power. So there's, it can't be underestimated how one thing leads to another in both directions, right? Down the path of reaction versus path of response. And mindfulness gives us that space to see what's happening, how we're triggered, how we're reacting, what would be the wise response.
Yeah. We spoke about how mindfulness can sort of help, prevent or help with depressive feelings. Is there, moving on from specifically mindfulness, is there other things that, students or people in general, staff as well, because I know staff listen to this as well, that can sort of prevent you feeling those depressing feelings? I guess social life and keeping an active social life is one.
Social life, the neuroscience findings show us that pretty much every psychopathology, including depression, involves reduced hippocampal volume, right? And hippocampus is the area that kind of not only involved in memory, but it's also a huge part of emotion regulation axis and the stress regulation axis. Yeah. So anything that will boost hippocampal neurogenesis, we now know that there are new cells, stem cells that travel into hippocampus, then grow into baby cells, and then eventually integrate themselves into the network, creating a bit of a sort of party there. They're like youngsters coming to let's boogie. And that sort of boogie attitude, actually what drives our curiosity towards life, it's that sense of novelty, right? Even though we're going through the same seemingly routine, noticing those little things, bird tweaking, that's what those new cells, those sort of adolescent cells that are full of energy and zest for life create in terms of our emotional enthusiasm, right, for life. And other things that allow to boost hippocampus is exercise.
Yeah.
Blueberries are very good for it, apparently. Dark chocolate, like 80% at least, because the milk inhibits the...
I had my little cousin who was eating milk chocolate and he's like, oh, but it helps you and it keeps you happy. I was like, not that chocolate. There's hardly any cocoa in that.
Yeah. Obviously not having too much processed food, which is difficult actually for young people because life is so expensive, right?
Yeah.
But it's better to have a carton of blueberries, which probably going to cost you the same money as getting, I don't know, a beef burger from McDonald's. You might not feel as satisfied from blueberries, but it's a difficult one to negotiate. But at least having nutritious food intake, it's important. We are what we eat. It's no doubt about that. So if the rest of your lifestyle is not very healthy, no amount of mindfulness really would help.
I can definitely vouch for that. So I used to be like 40 kilos heavier. And one of the biggest things that I remember helped with my own mental health, I never lost weight to look a certain way or to be a certain way. It was never to do it for like aesthetic reasons. It was mainly for my mental health.
Yeah.
I just remember thinking that when I would exercise and when I ate well, I felt good. And it really does reflect in how you feel. And at first I didn't want to accept this. I was like, no, but when I eat this, it's comfort food and it keeps me happy. But I think, again, it's this sort of suppressing and putting off the inevitable when you're binging on something.
Yeah.
But when you're giving yourself food that is nutritious, and I mean, I'm not where I want to be. I'm still working on it. But I think I've come a long way from how I used to be. And I think I definitely would vouch for the idea of exercise and eating well definitely has a big part on how you feel and how you reflect on
life. And if you
life.
don't have an hour, again, it doesn't have to be an hour, just, 10 minutes. There's so many, again, apps. There's days, I don't have time actually in my busy life to go to the gym every day. Just, I can't find that time.
Yeah.
But some positives of COVID is there's so many things online these days. I can just turn on, a yoga for 20 minutes on YouTube for free or a qigong, and just do it at home, and that replenishes my energy levels. And do it mindfully as well helps.
Yeah.
I mean, you can listen to the music, but actually doing it mindfully, again, by allowing the mind to be aligned with the body, you will feel much more revitalized.
I definitely, I do what I used to do is I used to mindfully sort of what I would normally do was I would go on a lot of walks. I love hiking and I love walking.
Yes.
Yeah, and behind my house there's this area which like it's not on the map, so then there's no one ever. There's deers and rabbits. And in the beginning I used to put my headphones in, so I wouldn't really be appreciating the air and the sounds and the birds. And then later I started taking out just sort of like, let me just be here in this present moment. And it really helped.
Well, if that's one outcome of the mindfulness course module that you took with me, I'm so happy. Because, yes, I would hate for you to miss all the beauty of being in nature.
I feel like we do that though. I think nowadays
with
with headphones and especially like with AirPods, I have them in all the time. Even now I was like, I need to take these out before I do the podcast. There's nothing playing in this, even just like sort of as a habit, it's in your ears all the time. And something that I was thinking about is, when is the last time you've sat in a car? Like I was driving today and I was thinking, when's the last time that I've just had nothing on and I've just listened to what's around me? Like there's a car beeping. I wouldn't hear any of it because I have something on.
Yeah.
So I think, one of the big things I'm like, maybe understanding that sometimes you need to take them out and hear the world. I feel like we sometimes block it out, and it's sometimes nice to hear the things that are going around you. It sort of brings you back to where you are. But yeah, definitely that's helped me.
Otherwise, life passes by and you just live in some other simulated world.
Definitely. And the kind of things that you listen to, that has an effect on what you think about, right? So if it's for example, a sad song, you're going to be thinking about sad things. If it's a happy song, but the point is, you're not thinking about what's happening there. You're sort of going into your own world, and life's just like passing you by because you're so preoccupied by this, right?
Yeah.
So anyways, moving on to the next topic. I wanted to also bring up some points on how, what to look for in other people. We've spoken about what to look for in ourselves. If you feel like this, you should do this, or if you feel like that, this could help. But I also feel like sometimes we're in a situation where we suspect that someone's not their usual self. They're sort of, maybe you're not seeing them less, maybe, being completely honest and raw, sometimes it's even like physically, like their hygiene or something, because that has a part in it, and it's something that we shouldn't judge. It's just something that's part of depression. You can sort of, forget certain things.
Self-care, yeah. Yes,
so, going into that, what are the kind of things that we should look out for, and what should we do, and how do we approach it with, I guess, sympathy and empathy, and being from a sensitive place? And what would you say?
Beautiful question. And it goes to, I started talking about Big Five, and we did talk about extroversion. So if you know your friend is extroverted and they suddenly started to socially withdraw, approaching them and asking, how are you doing? What's going on? Can I be of any support? Because as we said, even for a very extroverted person, there is a tendency for social withdrawal when something is challenging going on for them mentally. And it's also about knowing your friends and family, right? Some people are very good at asking for help, and some are not. Some have a tendency to kind of take challenges, not necessarily head on, but feel like it's for them to sort it out, right? And they
carry all the weight.
Yes, and they can go about doing those things not in the most constructive way sometimes. And so watching out for possibly self-harming behavior. And it's not just physical self-harm, just suddenly starting to do too many drugs or taking too much alcohol and so on. If you know your friend to be a relatively balanced person, but then suddenly you see them being constantly irritable, angry, easily tearful, again, just checking in with them. Is something going on for you there? It can be a little bit difficult with people who tend to be extroverted and take a lot of time alone, but even with them, you can notice kind of extra withdrawal and inability to sort of engage and articulate. It's often accompanied by this sort of condition called alexithymia, difficulty in putting feelings into words. But, a lot of I don't know actually how skilled the sort of younger generation in giving each other this peer support. We certainly were, I would say. So our friendships rested on it, right? Those kind of that sharing of the emotions. But again, it's how we do it and in which space we receive it, okay? And if you remember, we talked about difference between empathy and compassion.
Yes.
So we all know what empathy is, particularly emotional empathy. When someone shares with us something challenging, there is a tendency for it to trigger similar experience in us. And then we go into what we call emotional resonance or emotion. We get emotionally contagious by that emotion, by what's being shared with us. And yes, that can be helpful because it does create that shared experience that then can facilitate processing of it. But more potent for the person who is sharing with us is to receive them in the place of compassion. So where we stay connected with our own mindful awareness, we were receiving them in their emotion, with their emotional challenge and their suffering, but by doing that with a sort of sense of mindful presence, mindful awareness, we allow them the processing of their emotion faster, and we allow them to get out of, poor me attitude to what I actually learned from this experience. How did that possibly enrich me? What it taught me? How maybe gaining an alternative perspective in it, in oneself, but also what might have happened for the other person if it was, let's say, an argument between two friends or family members. So again, not to bring mindfulness in it. Well, I sort of
good.
did, but it does make a difference. And we did a little exercise to that extent during the course, and I do it in various other workshops. And it's amazing how, with very little practice of mindfulness, but just understanding that principle of being open and receptive without reactivity and judgment, just can shift even the conversation, like in real time. How the person who came with an emotional challenge, emotional issue to share, and to help for it to be processed, it just miraculously changes the way it's been spoken about and related to by that person.
Yeah. I mean, sort of connected to that is when you sometimes, when I work with clients, sometimes if they're dealing with something quite difficult or if they're feeling quite depressed, a lot of the time it's quite common where you go up to them and go, "Are you okay?" And they go, "Everything's fine. It's fine." And obviously that's a part of their withdrawal of sort of from society and everything. Yeah. I think, it's very difficult and it is sort of case by case, but you do need to, it is sometimes, this is something I've learned, it's sometimes just asking once isn't enough. Sometimes you do need to gently and very nicely, be like, "I feel like something's wrong." And only because the reason why I say this is, I'm not trying to be nosy, I'm not trying to find out more about, but it's, if there is like suicide ideation going on or anything like that, you want to obviously not let it get to that point. Yeah. And sometimes you sort of giving them that hand is exactly what they need in that moment, even if they don't feel like it. Yeah. So I feel like we all talk about, check in with your friends, but are we checking in the right way? Are we checking in enough? I feel like people just think, I texted her last month and she said she's okay, or he said he's okay. But was that good enough? I feel like
you're absolutely right. So yes, kind of going deeper into what we mean by checking in. So yes, a text might not do it because we also have the social norms of not kind of dumping our things on others, right? But it's again, if it's a physical checking in person. It's the quality of our presence.
Definitely, yeah.
That will make a difference as well, right? And a lot of the efficacy of psychotherapy, regardless of the approach, depends on what's called psychotherapeutic presence, how the therapist is present with you. Yeah. So if we're present with our friend and they feel they're not being judged, even if they're experiencing, the lowest emotion, if they feel they're not being judged, we're actually there. And when we say compassion, it's the warmth, it's that love that they will feel. We feel it. We feel each other's anxiety. Absolutely. We'll feel each other's love. I mean, it's undeniable. It's not just reading facial expressions. We feel. Yeah.
It's like a vibe.
Yeah. So if they feel safe in your presence to share what they might be hiding from themselves. Yes, absolutely. 100% you're spot on. It's the quality of checking in. Yeah. Which again takes us back of what is quality of our presence when we do that.
I think, when you ask, it's just about try to be as open-minded as to any response they give. Like if they get angry, don't take it to heart. If they say, I'm fine, don't think that's like, really try to be as non-judgmental as possible as when you ask that question, because, sometimes it could be something that you completely didn't expect. And sometimes it could be, or sometimes it can be unexpected in the sense that they might open up and completely say everything to you. And you might be like, whoa, that's a lot going on. And you don't really know what to do in that moment. But I feel like, just, try maybe more than once and just say it as gently as possible that if, there is things that you can do to help. And I know it doesn't seem like it now. That's something that I've done before where someone was like, you don't get it. And I'm not going to go into too much about, they're like, you don't get it. I was like, maybe I don't, but I can.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the reason, difference between emotion and empathy. We might not have a shared experience for it to be triggered in us, so we can properly empathize emotionally, but we can always go into compassion. Because suffering as a general condition is our common experience. We know what suffering is, regardless of the cause or particular context or particular situation.
So I guess we'll just sort of wrap up. I do want to say before I go on to final thoughts, we've spoken about quite sensitive topics and things that I think maybe if you are struggling with any of the things that we've spoken about today in terms of depression or even anxiety or any sort of symptoms that you feel like you're not able to perhaps function as well as you used to, we will put some links below in the video and on our Instagram, just so that you can contact. There'll be student wellbeing. We have student wellbeing at Brunel, which would be more than happy to help. But do you have any closing thoughts? Anything you would say to our listeners in terms of depression and mindfulness?
Yes. Well, one thing I would like to mention is that when we are stuck in a challenging experience, like low moods, sadness, there is a tendency for us to expect to feel the same the next day, the next hour, the next moment. So we need to have the openness that actually we can shift. We can shift in any moment. And again, that's what practice shows us, that we can shift in any moment. Not to downplay when someone is really in a very challenging state and energetically drained, because one of the hallmarks of depression, of major depressive disorder, is really, really low energy. So it's incredibly important to be very, very self-compassionate and not expect too much of oneself, and take those little baby steps, like what can I do each minute that will give me some more joy, that will give me some more pleasure. And yes, do seek help.
I mean, thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming on today. I think it was actually a very interesting conversation. I learned a lot. So yeah, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, Hannah, for inviting me, and thank you for sharing your experience of mindfulness. That's really helpful for me as well. So I really appreciate it.